All right, what is going on? Welcome back to the show. Today, I am joined by Brian Miner. Brian, thank you for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, dude. So, for the listeners who might not know, can you just give us a super brief introduction on who you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, so I am a coach first and foremost, and I own my own coaching company and work with um, kind of a wide spectrum of individuals, mostly focused on either body composition, improving body comp, and that can range from just the sort of intermediate kind of level lifter up to professional natural bodybuilding, and then also work with a lot of people focused on strength like
Right.
powerlifting, or even just non-competitors that are wanting to get stronger as well. So it's a bit of a range there, but I would say strength and hypertrophy and fat loss are kind of the biggest demographics of people that I work with in terms of goals. And then I also compete as a natural bodybuilder as well. Haven't competed for a few years. 2017 was my last prep, and then also a raw powerlifter as well. And it's also been 2017 since I competed in that. So the goal is to compete at least in powerlifting next year, and then consider maybe a prep the year after that potentially. But we'll see on that. So
Okay. Okay, I like it. So you're kind of coming from two different camps here, and you work with that's a pretty diverse client base as well, as far as like more advanced powerlifters and like pro bodybuilders. So where did this kind of like diversity for you come from?
originally it was the primary goal was hypertrophy. Like when I first started training, it was for sports. I played hockey growing up, and then um, as that sort of came to a close, like I wanted a competitive outlet, and the gym was something that allowed me to stay very goal oriented. Um, and then the competitive flame that I had, it helped sort of fuel that. Competing in my first show in 2010, and then it was that off season between 2010 and 2012 that I started to kind of dabble in powerlifting. And at the time, it was largely because it was thought to be like a very effective way of building muscle.
Okay.
And it's I think it can still be part of an off season plan, but and I don't know if you were like training within kind of the evidence-based community, or were sort knew much of what was going on back then, but it was like a lot of people like Lane Norton had been competing in powerlifting for at least a few years by then. And so it was sort of the a popular thing to do. And I think because one, a lot of people just enjoyed having a quantifiable measure of progress outside
Right.
of just aesthetics. So that was something that I got involved with. And it served its purpose for keeping me focused on um, the progression side of things in the
Right.
gym. um, and I think that's something that a lot of bodybuilders still lack in a
Right.
way. But there's also a lot of pitfalls to over specializing in powerlifting if you're also a bodybuilder. And so um, I think the pendulum sort of swung too far in that direction back then, where people were emphasizing powerlifting like at the expense of bodybuilding when they were trying to actually enhance the bodybuilding. Um, so I think originally that was probably the case for me. And then between 2012 and 2017, like I had already competed in a few meets by then, and I enjoyed it, but I recognized some of the pitfalls of that over specialization. I made sure I kept some um, hypertrophy work, quote unquote. I still tried to pay attention to some of those gaps in the programming that can occur with a pure strength biased approach. And and kind of fast forward to where we are, where I'm at now. And I love the strength side of things.
Okay.
But I also, have that balance now where I understand, like, okay, there's a time and a place to sort of dial up specificity when it comes to strength.
Right.
Um, and I think ultimately the two can coexist quite neatly, despite what some people, or at least I believe they can. Some people may say otherwise. And I think it all comes down to how you structure your training and strategically picking when you compete in powerlifting, and then making sure that each phase of your plan is sort of integrated into the other. So like a peaking phase for powerlifting, for example, is maybe an opportunity to resensitize to volume, and then you come back and train hypertrophy work following the meet. And so, but we can kind of get into some of that structure later, maybe. But ultimately, like it's always just been born out of really enjoying the strength side of things, outside, and not really enjoying the pump. Or I love the pump, but
Okay.
not going in there and aimlessly chasing a pump, and having some kind of more strategic structure to the training.
Absolutely. And I would say that's probably somewhat what's fed into where like so many podcasts that I've heard you on in the past, you are talking about how do we take this very structured approach to our hypertrophy training where we're not just like chasing the pump, whereas so many like power lifters or within that style of training, I should say, so methodical about how we go about everything. And how can we somewhat take that and apply it to like a more hypertrophy focused style of training, correct?
Yeah, I think that's I think there's a happy medium there, because I think you can, even on the powerlifting side, I think sometimes people will be a little bit overly methodical. And I think that's one thing that auto-regulation, and the toolbox that comes with that helps us get around, is knowing, where we can be pliable within our training on a day-to-day basis, to, find that balance between the stimulus we're trying to achieve and, the cost associated with it, when it comes to fatigue. And so, I think some of that, like the fatigue management side of powerlifting, that's pretty much required in order to do your best.
Right.
I think that is something that bodybuilding can, I think, learn a lot from, is just understanding that the process should be looked at through a wider lens, rather than how can I maximize the stimulus on at any given point in time, which I think is what a lot of bodybuilders still do, and they don't look at the residual effects and kind of the bottom line, at the end of a training block, what's going to yield you the best progress. Is it blasting a muscle group and then having to wait a full week until you can hit it again, or is it you know operating within a volume tolerance for a given session, so you can turn around and hit it again, and understanding some of the um, the relationships between these variables, and understanding that there's a um, you know amounts of volume that you shouldn't go beyond, and not that there's like a definitive number
Right.
for everybody, but just understanding that there's a point of diminishing returns when it comes to volume within a session, um, and just understanding how all of it kind of interrelates when it comes to managing fatigue, and getting that stimulus and trying to maximize the bottom line, which is ultimately what we're trying to do with powerlifting anyway. And then on the flip side, I think powerlifters can learn a lot from bodybuilders, in the sense that I think emphasizing hypertrophy should probably be the emphasis more often than not in the off season, unless you're a competitor who's competing very frequently. I think spending more time, training with some submaximal loading, even potentially getting away from the comp lifts a little bit more frequently, can be beneficial for a lot of people. But it's so context dependent.
Right.
Depends on someone's proficiency in the lifts and their joint integrity, their resilience, their burnout, and whether or not that's an issue. So that it's hard to give like bottom line recommendations
Right.
for people, but it's I look at it as just this large toolbox of tools that we can use and a lot of just conceptual things that we need to consider for each specific piece of context that we have.
Absolutely, man. Okay, perfect. So let's dive into that. Some of these concepts specific for hypertrophy then. So first and foremost, you kind of talked about this idea of, okay, we have this point of diminishing returns as far as volume per session. So I would ask, do you see it? Is there a specific like overload threshold, so to speak, that we need to hit to stimulate muscle growth, like within a week or within a training session? How do you kind of conceptualize that to people? And then on the flip side, how do we know when we've taken that too far?
Okay, so the first question, is there an overload threshold? I think absolutely there is. Um, and I think the easiest way to illustrate that is you could do some body weight squats for a few sets and not get anything out of it, but if you added load, eventually you're probably going to get something out of it, but there's going to be a point in time where there's that shift from net zero to positive. So on like a physiological level, the overload threshold would be the amount of work, however, not the traditional definition necessarily, but the amount of stimulus, let's say, or mechanical tension required to result in a net positive protein balance within skeletal muscle tissue, like in the post-exercise recovery period. So and a lot of that has to do too with behavior post-exercise and your nutrition post-exercise. And so um, understanding that when we talk about overload, we're talking about the amount of work that's required to lead to positive protein balance if we're speaking about hypertrophy. And then I think a lot of people, when they think of overload, they're thinking more along the lines of, what they're lifting in the gym and does it exceed what we did previously. And that's probably a better way to look at that is like the term progressive overload. And so progressive overload would be, keeping pace with adaptations as they occur. So as we, get bigger and, all of our muscle fibers, are able to produce more force, we need to then work a little bit harder or increase the load, increase the amount of reps in order to continue to place tension on those like high threshold muscle fibers. Otherwise, there's not going to be a robust response to the training. And so so it is sort of a chicken and the egg scenario where yes, we do need to be increasing load over time, but the process of increasing, and by load, let's just say stress, we need to be increasing the training stress over time, but it's not the act of surpassing a previous number that's causing these physiological adaptations. It's doing enough to maintain like this overload range. So we have our lower end, like the overload threshold could be considered like the MEV or minimum effective volume or dose within the session itself.
Right.
And then then like the MRV could be considered the most that we can do and still see a positive adaptation from potentially. So it's making sure that we're providing enough stimulus to stay within that range as we continue to, as our ceiling and our capacity to produce force and generate strength increases. So that's how I sort of differentiate between the two. Overload and then progressive overload is keeping pace with adaptations is progressive overload, and overload is meeting the requisite stimulus to elicit those adaptations. So, and then what was your other question? The second question?
So basically, how do we, so essentially what you're saying is like how we are, you're more or less defining kind of how, basically what we need to do to fall within this range to stimulate.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
basically, then what I'm asking is, what are kind of some tangible things we can look at to really tell, okay, so like you mentioned MEV and MRV. So basically minimum effective volume, the minimum amount we need to do to know that we are doing enough to stimulate growth. And then like MRV, basically the maximum we can recover from past that point is probably like uh less productive. We're going to be getting less out of doing more. Probably not the best definition of that, but how do we kind of know we are in like, okay,
Yeah.
probably about, we're providing our body about the amount of overload we need.
Yeah. So I think ultimately, performance is going to be the best proxy for all of this, which is why a lot of people sort of get this sort of mixed up. Is they look at performance as, this is what is driving whether or not I surpassed a previous stimulus is what's driving the, the
Right.
physiological adaptation. Um, so, with that said, performance is, we don't have MRI available to us to, are we growing muscle, is a result of this training. But, we can look at our performance and the trends over time, under similar conditions, um, to assess, is this training overloading in nature? Because if you're progressing, then chances are it's overloading in some capacity. Like there's different systems, there can be the, you know, you can be looking at hypertrophy, you can be looking at, just purely neurological adaptations. But, over time, like the longer time scale we see these, these gradual trends and increases in performance, the more likely that hypertrophy is occurring, in steering some of that. So, um, you could change, for example, you could change and rotate in an exercise, a new exercise every block. So say you
Right.
did back squats one block, and then you switch to front squats, then you switch to hack squats. Like you could see increases in trends, across that entire block in performance. But a lot of that could just be, regaining lost proficiency. And so, um, it's not all, like in that time scale, it may not be indicative of hypertrophy. But if you've kept those exercises in long enough to see these trends, occur over time, then it's the best indicator we have. I'll say that. And I know like um, like some people, I know we were on Steve Hall's podcast not too long ago with Dr. Mike Israetel and Jared Feather, and it was Eric Helms and myself, and we were talking about our paper, that we had written in response to theirs. But one area of, and this wasn't necessarily related to their original paper, but one topic of discussion was, whether or not pumps and soreness are predictive of hypertrophy. And that there's not enough, we don't, our thought is there's not enough evidence to say that they are.
Right.
In fact, there's some evidence to say, at least when it comes to soreness, that, or even pumps, that the pumps aren't necessarily predictive, and soreness can be, um, pretty unreliable indicator as well. And if it's taken in excess, and it's, say that soreness comes with a lot of muscle damage, it can actually be detrimental. Um, so when you look at, I guess, the alternatives, like maybe there's something to that under specific circumstances, but I think performance over time is going to be the most reliable indicator when you consider the alternatives.
Okay. Okay. So in a more acute setting, so let's use an example of, all right, so you were, Brian Borstein is someone who's been on the show a couple times as well.
Yeah.
So the listeners will be familiar with him, super advanced,
Mm-hmm.
super jacked. So I'm guessing for him, like, okay, an acute setting of, and I don't actually know what his training progression is like week to week, but I think this is a good example. So like across 3 weeks, it's pretty because often I think I know a mistake that I've made for a long time is getting so caught up in just beating the logbook every week, It is like, okay, well, fuck, now that at the end of my mesocycle, my form has just deteriorated drastically.
Mhm.
Was that actually any more stimulative of training? Probably not. But
Yeah.
also, if it's like, okay, for 3 weeks, like I haven't progressed via reps or load. So, like in an acute setting like that, how are you measuring like, or is it more or less, hey, we're just guessing like at the end of the mesocycle, hopefully we made progress? Does that make question make sense?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. So um, that's why I think it's important to compare similar environments when you're looking at performance. So, um, and this is something like Dr. Mike has talked about a bit, and this is one of his sort of critiques of using performance as a proxy. Is it can be misleading until you deload, and then maybe you see after you deload your strength at that given point has increased from where it began the previous block. And so I certainly I agree with that. Like there's limitations when you, especially across a block in an acute sense,
Right.
of using performance because fatigue can go up and mask some of those like your quantifiable
Right.
numbers that you're hitting, and it can mask some of the adaptations that could still very well be occurring. So um, and to be honest, with a hypertrophy program, like I think deloading is it, this is going to be a little bit controversial, and I would have thought this was very controversial maybe a year ago. But Chris Beardsley wrote a really good. I don't know if you're familiar with Chris Beardsley. So he has a really good post on his blog about deloading and whether or not we like, do we really need deloads? And I think most would agree that yes, we do. But one of the arguments that he makes is, it's more from the perspective of, um, psychological, fatigue and joint integrity. Because if you think about it, I mean, he's got a point. Like if you're structuring your program appropriately, like you want the fatigue that would be masking your performance, you want that to be more or less dissipating by the time you hit that muscle group again. In a well-structured program, there shouldn't be a ton of residual fatigue on a session-to-session basis. Now, I think in practice, that's not always how it works out. I mean, I think it's really hard to put together a program that's getting the most out of it that has no residual fatigue. I think it's difficult to do. But um you from a muscle growth perspective in particular, if we look at the different elements of fatigue, like we would want most of those to be back to baseline before we're hitting that muscle group again. And if we look at like central fatigue, like if central fatigue's still elevated, that's going to be an issue because then we're not going to be able to recruit higher threshold motor units. Peripheral fatigue's so acute anyway, that's kind of irrelevant. But for structuring like across a week, but then like muscle damage is the other element where if we have a lot of residual muscle damage that's accumulating, then that can start to create and limit central, or start causing central fatigue to the point where um, we're no longer able to recruit these high threshold motor units. So if all of those are in check though, and you're recovering, like you shouldn't see as many fluctuations in performance as you would otherwise, but you're still going to see some because there's still going to be fatigue that's outside of training that's going to be um, impacting that bottom line. And so um, it can be, I think, challenging in an acute sense knowing, but the yeah, I think I don't want to get ahead of myself here. um, with these deloads, I think they could be a little bit reactionary in nature,
Okay.
but also For most athletes, I still think just because of joint integrity and just psychological burnout, like I don't think I almost take a more holistic approach rather than just looking at performance in the acute sense. Like if performance is going up and they're like, okay, like fatigue is not an issue, it's not masking anything, we're still able to see these increases on a week to week or every 2 week basis, whether it be additional reps, load, whatever. um, I still look at it from the perspective of, okay, like how sustainable is this? Are we going to be putting ourselves back by pushing for one more week when maybe we could just pull back for the week while we're still feeling good, and then sort of reboot, and then hit it again, because eventually you're going to have to deload anyway,
Right.
um, you know assuming you know have some type of wear and tear that's occurring, which I
Right.
guess shouldn't be assumed, but I think in practice is usually the case. Training hard for 52 straight weeks of the year is, I don't think many people can do that physically or mentally. So I do think there's something to being a little bit proactive there, and that allows us to. I think the residual fatigue has less of a role when that's the case.
Okay. Okay. So in a nutshell, it sounds like, and I absolutely don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you're more in favor of like an autoregulatory kind of approach to this rather than like like one set progression across like, hey, this is how we progress all the mesocycles. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. And then when you are implementing a deload, just out of curiosity, what is that typically, how do you typically program it?
For hypertrophy,
Yes, sir.
so for hypertrophy, like if we look at the concepts of deloading, I mean the primary goal is to reduce fatigue.
Right.
And let's say we do have some residual fatigue built up. Say we have some muscle damage that's higher than we want, by the end of the block, which is going to probably be the case for a lot of people. Even if maybe it doesn't need to be that way, but I think in a practical sense, it often is. Um, the primary goal is to reduce fatigue, with the secondary goal maintaining adaptations. And obviously, maintaining adaptations, that's like yes, we want to do that. Like saying that's a secondary goal doesn't make much sense. But when you look at it from a perspective of wanting to use the deload to help increase preparedness
Mm.
in performance coming off of that, then it makes a little bit more sense when you realize that fatigue is going to dissipate faster than fitness in most
Right.
cases. So like you're going to be able to, like, one, for example, say you took 2 days off from the gym after training 20 days straight. You're not that that's nothing I would recommend, but just for this example, it's like that would be a great way to drop some of that fatigue. It would certainly drop it to a measurable degree,
Right.
um, but you probably wouldn't really detrain at all during that time. So these deloads are short enough where you can pull back pretty significantly when it comes to volume, and I'd say 50 to 75% sometimes in extreme cases, and that's going to address a lot of the fatigue element.
Right.
But also, when it comes to maintaining adaptations, you have to look at what adaptation you're trying to maintain. And if it's strength, then that's going to look like proficiency with the movement. It's going to look like more related to the absolute loading when it comes to intensity. So strength deloads, what I may do is reduce volume but keep load the same for a movement. Like, so let's say we finished a block doing 3 sets of 5 at 200 kilos, and then the deload may be like 2 sets of 3 at 200 kilos. So it's like you're still doing the same load. You're keeping your familiarity with the heavy load, but you're pulling back on volume by a little over 50%, and then you're also reducing relative effort. So your RPE or RIR is going to be, RPE will be lower, RIR will be higher. And so that sort of addresses fatigue from two different avenues there. When it comes to hypertrophy, I think it makes more sense when you realize like hypertrophy is going to be more mediated by effort and proximity to failure than it is like absolute loading. And so, keeping the load the same is important there. But making sure you're still within a close enough proximity to failure to still place some tension on those high threshold motor units. I think that's going to be important if you're trying to, maximize, maintaining these adaptations, or at least, pay attention to that side of it. Because if we were just trying to drop fatigue as much as we could, and not maintain adaptations, like we could just take a full week off.
Right.
And I get this question a lot, like, okay, if fatigue dissipates faster than fitness, why don't we just do weeks of active rest? And it's a good question, but it comes back to this whole, looking through a wide lens and thinking, okay, well, if I take a week off, the workload that I'm going to come back to is going to have to be lower than it would have otherwise, and it's going to take some more time to build back up to, what may be, the volume we were targeting,
Right.
otherwise. And so you may have to spread an intro phase across 2 weeks instead of one. And so it's more about the repeated bout effect and making sure we keep some of that in place, and we're mitigating downstream muscle damage by keeping some work in there while also maintaining adaptations. And I don't think it takes much. I mean, I think a couple sets, if you're doing 5 sets of an exercise, cutting that down to 2 sets and keeping RPE within 3 to 4 reps shy of failure, like that's
Okay.
you're gonna do okay there, and you're gonna still drop a lot of fatigue. Now, I talked about like the deload with the psychological element. Like I try to get a read for each person. If they go into a deload and they haven't worked with me before, and they sort of have biases towards one method over another, like if they look at it like, okay, I've never maintained loading during a deload, or all of my sets have been significantly easier, these deloads might be like a rude away. It might not serve the purpose as well as we wanted them to,
Right.
because we want it to be a psychological break as well. And so, and you mentioned Brian, and I don't know if you brought him up because you knew this or not, but he and I actually worked together. And so, so he, the deload example is a good one, because that was sort of something that we went over with him. Like it was sort of a new way of deloading for him. And I think it was a bit of a mental adjustment at first.
Right.
And I think that's why it's, as a coach, and as an athlete too, it helps understanding or being able to communicate and understand the rationale behind these approaches. Because if you tell somebody, okay, I want you to go in and still train at a relatively high RPE, and they're not really, they're used to training at sub 5 RPE during their deloads. It's like it's gonna be a recipe for not disaster, but it's not going to yield the outcome that maybe you would have wanted otherwise. But if you explain to them, this is how we're addressing the fatigue through volume reduction, and say here's another thing, like in strength, oftentimes you don't want to really change much in terms of the rep ranges during the deload. Like you don't want to take someone from sets of 5 if they're in a strength-based program to sets of 15. It's like they're going to get wrecked. But having these subtle shifts in intensity. So if someone's joints are hurting, let's say Brian's doing sets of 5 to 8 on squat, in the week preceding his deload, and then the next week he's saying, okay, my knees are a little bit achy. Maybe we go to sets of 8 to 12, or even 6 to 10, something just a little bit lighter. And then we reduce volume on top of that. So I think with hypertrophy, you have some extra options. Not that you don't have these with strength, but I think with hypertrophy, there's less potential negative impact there,
Right.
um, where you can reduce the absolute loading and not compromise the hypertrophy goal. Whereas if you reduce the absolute loading excessively with the strength side of things, you're going to lose some of those adaptations that are, intensity driven.
Okay. Okay. That makes complete sense. So, and then when we're diving into, again, kind of this auto-regulatory approach, I know I've heard you talk about like this dynamic double progression model that you like to implement. Do you feel like that's
Yeah.
still, and again, I don't want to like put any words in your mouth, like, hey, this is only what I do. But do you feel like that's still like your preferred model for progression as far as hypertrophy goes?
Um, I think it's very versatile. I use like the term dynamic double progression. It was sort of like Jacob Skepis and I kind of came up with it because it was called it DDP just because everything has an acronym now, and so it was sort of like stated in jest, but so I chuckle anytime somebody mentions like DDP to me. But no, I think it is like it's nothing that hasn't been done before, but I think understanding why it can be so effective helps, because in research studies, this is essentially what they're doing. Because most research, they're taking people to failure, or like you might see they did 3 sets of 8 to 12 RM, and so it's not that they're repping their 12 rep max 3 times. It's that they're starting with a 12 RM, what's in that range, and if they fall outside that range, they're adjusting the load, and so each set is to failure or a matched relative effort. So all that I really suggest is, um, adjusting there is the proximity to failure. So let's say rather than 8 to 12 RM, it's 8 to 12 at a 2 to 3 RIR. And so um, I think it can be, I think it can work for every lift, to be honest, when it comes to hypertrophy. Strength, I think it can be a little bit um, less versatile there because you don't want to be training at such a high RPE with a lot of strength movements,
Right.
especially for the volume work, just because it can really wear you down. Um, and judging submaximal RPEs, like trying to maintain a 5 RPE can be challenging for people. Um, a 5 or 6. It's just the higher the RPE, the easier it is to gauge. And so I find that for hypertrophy, it can be a really useful tool because most people know when they're within a couple reps shy of failure.
Right.
And for isolation movements, I think it's great. For most compound movements, I think it's a good tool. Now, one thing I've been using a little bit more. Well, let me back up for a sec. So the big advantage of using like a auto-regulated or dynamic double progression is that it's still scaling the stimulus based off of your preparedness on that day. So it's aiming to keep you within that overload range based off of how you're performing. So if you're like if you are matching or exceeding a rep or a logbook number, but it's at the expense of a much higher degree of effort, like are you really, is that driven, like, yes, you beat the logbook, but did you actually improve, or did you just work a little harder? Is it, what did you just train 1 rep closer to failure? And we want the progressions to be driven by adaptations, not necessarily just increased effort, or as you sort of alluded to, breaking form. Like that's very common for people. Um, so what's nice about this is the rep count is more or less auto-regulated within that range, and even if you fall outside that range, it's not a big deal. I mean, the range is just simply in place to sort of get you in an approximate loading zone that's appropriate for that exercise. Like, I'm not going to have
8 to 12, for example.
yeah, so let's say 8 to 12, for like let's say we're doing like a row,
Right.
like a machine row, 8 to 12. Um, if I'm like recovering really well, I may be able to hit, the top end of that rep range, um, sooner than I would have otherwise had I just been doing traditional double progression where I'm only adding 1 rep per week.
Right.
And so I think there's pros and cons to using like these like static models of progression. But I do think one area in sort of a happy medium that I've been using more is having somebody, and this works especially well for like some of the heavier compound movements. If we're even in hypertrophy phases, so let's now say we're doing 6 to 10 on a squat. So like in week 1, I might have someone work up to, or after they warm up, I want you to pick a weight that you think you could hit, 10 reps at a, 3 RAR, or 4 RAR. And so I want them to sort of aim for the higher end of that range in the first week. And so let's say they, hit 150 kilos for 10 in week 1 at a, 3 RAR. And then in week 2, what I'll do is I'll statically add load. So I'll say like 155 kilos or 152.5 kilos, but then I'll leave the reps open ended. So I'll statically increase load. I'll keep RAR, I'll assign whatever I want that to be. Oftentimes I'll keep it the same as the week prior.
Okay.
And then whatever reps they get, it's like that. And so as we add load on a week to week basis, I think it helps people who are very used to, wanting to add load weekly.
Mm-hmm.
It allows them to still do that, but by keeping the reps open ended, it helps keep their technique a little bit more consistent, because they know that, okay, I can't be expected to hit the same reps as I did the week prior every single week with additional load on top of that, and so what we see is like this natural sort of like linear trend across the block where loading is going up and reps are kind of trending down. But since we still are using RAR, it's still auto-regulated in nature. And so if they're adapting exceptionally well, we may see some weeks where, maybe that slope of that downward trend in reps is a little bit more shallow. And so someone might be able to replicate the same reps 2 weeks in a row at the same RIR with heavier loading. So, and that's like an added bonus, but it's still, at the end of the day, since we know hypertrophy is not intensity dependent or like loading dependent,
Right.
like as long as we're within like that 5 to 6 rep and above, up to like 30 reps, I think that's sort of the accepted range, like 6 to 30.
Right.
I think most people, at least based on the literature, it seems, there's been hypertrophy that's been studied within that range on a set to set basis can be relatively equated, if matched for effort. So, so as long, I try not to add so much load that someone falls below the bottom end of that. So like they're still getting at least 6 reps. But we're able to have those linear increases in load where it's like, okay, the logbook is going up with load, like that checks that box. Like psychologically, it's a little bit easier. And I find people they're less susceptible to breaking technique. Like sometimes they still do with the dynamic double progression model because they're trying to match or exceed a previous rep count. Because you sort of expect if you add load, reps are going to trend down over time. And so I just find it keeps people a little bit more honest. And for those heavier movements, it also adds, it's going to be better for strength having, linear increases in load. And so I talked about like the whole dual athlete thing. I like using that for people that are really interested in both, hypertrophy and strength. Like even in their volume phases, I might have, linear increases in load, but we're still keeping our set volume where we want for hypertrophy, and we're just letting reps sort of trend down, but not too far. If that makes sense.
Okay, absolutely. No, that's a super interesting model because yeah, again, it's like a linear progression, but how you
Yeah.
approach it from the mindset side of things.
Yeah.
It's almost like the differentiating factor there, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then as far as RIR, like in this progression model, are you typically, I know you put 3 to 4 out there. Is that typically like, hey, we're going to stick in this 3 to 4 range or?
Yeah. So I think it depends on the movement. Usually I'll start a block, kind of regardless of goal, hypertrophy or strength.
Mhm.
Since we're coming off of a deload the week prior, usually, and say we're cutting volume by 50% on our from our peak volume to our deload, there's still, like, I like having sort of an intermediate step, like an intro phase. I mean, there's been benefits shown of having these intro phases of training, and so the intro phases usually I'll have like a little bit lighter than or like more submaximal in terms of the RIR than the week after that. But then after that, I mean, I've progressed RIR before, or RPE, whichever one we want to use. Um, I've progressed those, but I don't think they need to be progressed. And I think there's benefits of not progressing them in the sense that it's a little bit easier to see trends because you're comparing apples to apples, and not that you couldn't, like if I did 150 kilos at 10 reps at a 3 RAR, and then the next week I did 150 for 11 at a 2 RAR, it's like you could still look at that and realize, like, okay, I just did one extra rep, but it was the expense of
Right.
an increased rep in reserve or a decreased rep in reserve. Um, so I think that's going to be it eliminates some of the noise, I think, having an RIR that's close enough to failure that we know it's adaptive in nature, but is also keeping people, managing fatigue relatively well. Like, I don't really know how beneficial it is, and I'm not convinced that it's more beneficial to go from like a 3 RIR to a 2 RIR to a 1 RIR versus just staying at a 2 RIR the entire block. That hasn't been examined in research. So, and probably, I mean, RIR and RPE are oftentimes sort of looked at as the inverse of one another. And I'm kind of using that, like explaining it in that way here. But, RIR and RPE are, they're, it's beyond, like, RPE is a subjective measure. Like, if
Right.
someone tells you what their RPE is, it's that is what their RPE is. How well that's correlated to reps in reserve is another thing. Like, ideally, they are sort of the inverse of one another. A 9 RPE would be a 1 RIR. And in more advanced trainees, that's usually the case. But in beginners, someone can say, like, I'm at an 8 RPE, but really be at like a 4 RAR, if that makes sense. So I think it's an important distinction to make. But when it comes to actually progressing, like if I'm using RPE and I know somebody is at a greater rep in reserve than I want them to be, like, say I tell someone I want you to train or like at an 8 RPE, but they're at 5 reps in reserve when I see the video,
Right.
it's clear that they have a lot more than 2 reps in the tank. I might program a little bit heavier, or like, okay, I want you to train at a 9 RPE, because
Right.
it might help them sort of calibrate that scale, and it'll get them a little bit closer to where I want them to be.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm not sure why it would be more beneficial to have a, you know, escalating RPE throughout the block. I think psychologically it might be nice for some people, but I don't think we have enough information to say one is better than the other. Um, and I like to minimize excessive moving parts simply because I think it's important to be able to look at the training and be able to identify if progression is occurring or progression and progress are occurring, because we want it to be both.
Right. Right. Okay. Cool. Cool. That makes sense. And yeah. So, and I know we talked about Steve Hall a bit before. So like he does my programming right now. So
Oh, he does. Awesome.
I follow like a progressive RIR, and
Yeah.
that's very similar to what you're saying here. it
Hmm.
like psychologically, I think, and I like absolutely. So it's interesting to like have these conversations and kind of look at it from both perspectives because like
Hmm.
psychologically, I think that it feels good because I see
Yeah.
my progression week to week. But then on the flip side, I think one of the hardest things for me has been like, as I alluded to earlier, like making sure that I'm not taking it like, okay, I have to like RAR drop this week, so I have to add a rep no matter what. And then getting out of the
Hmm.
mindset of like, if I don't beat my logbook, then like I'm failing essentially, right? So I think it is kind of, and I have many of my clients follow. It goes back to
Hmm.
the client, but I think it is kind of a double-edged sword. Like we could look at it from
Definitely.
a perspective there.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I I totally get the psychological aspect, but it's interesting you mentioned that, like, that in and of itself, it's like it's trying to quench an element of that, trying to satisfy this psychological drive to see visual quantifiable increases.
Mm-hmm.
But then it can be, it can mess with your head if you don't see that. And like you said, you end up chasing that additional rep kind of either way, or feeling pressure to.
Absolutely.
So I think, and it's, we know that, from a peripheral fatigue perspective, that you know fatigue tends to see this exponential increase as we get closer to failure. There's going from, like, your performance on a second set is going to be probably significantly better if you stop at 3 RIR versus 1, um, and because those additional reps, they tend to be slower. um, and as a result of that, the tension stimulus is probably, the magnitude of tension and the duration of exposure, it's going to be probably a more anabolic rep if you were to isolate it in and of itself. But um, I think that's also splitting hairs a little bit, because once you account for the fatigue management side of things, I think a lot of that kind of washes out. Um, because if you're creating more tension within a rep, and by tension I mean, you know matched magnitude, but also the duration of exposure. A longer rep is going to be more impulse, or time under the same tension. But when you account for the fact that, okay, this might impact my subsequent set more, or my subsequent session more, if muscle soreness is elevated, and or muscle damage is elevated, that can start to kind of smooth things out to the point where, I mean, in these shorter term studies that we see, 8 weeks long, like, we don't see a distinct benefit of training, you know, to failure versus, training a few reps shy of failure,
Right.
and I think that's, whether or not that would still be the case long term. um, I don't know. Because it's kind of interesting, because the people that are used to training closer to failure, they become more well adapted to handling that training too. So I think a case can be made there as well, as if you're training consistently, to failure, or 0 to 1 RIR, like, yeah, out of the gate you may be a little bit wrecked, and the residual effects might be negative. But um, the human body is pretty fascinating at what it can adapt to. And the repeated bout effect, if that's what you're consistently exposing yourself to, you're going to be better equipped to handle that. And um so I don't know. In I would be interested to see, long term, like, if there was like a 6 month study. I don't know if this will ever happen, but like a 6 month to a year study where they had groups training consistently to failure versus groups leaving, about 3 or 4 reps in reserve.
Right.
What the outcome would be. I think if I had to guess, there's probably like this tipping point where, in the short term, it would be either no additional benefit or maybe even detrimental training to failure. But then in the long term, maybe the failure group would do a little bit better. You don't know. Simply because maybe they would adapt to that and be able to better handle that fatigue. Um, but it's interesting. I mean, that's why, like, a lot of these discussions, like, but there's so much with training and nutrition that we still don't know for sure. And so you have to look at these concepts and, make these inferences and like understand that, we could all be wrong to varying degrees, and so I think it's just using the information that we have available and just making the best judgment. And um, a lot of these discussions are, it's a very small demographic that it probably applies to.
Right.
And even then it's probably a small magnitude of difference. Um, like the discussion that Steve hosted about the volume progression, I'm not saying that static set volume is going to be superior. I think there's practical benefits to keeping it more or less static. But I don't think it's like accumulating volume across a block is going to be significantly detrimental. I think in the end it's probably pretty similar. And if there's a magnitude of difference, it's probably relatively small. So and it's just funny because like a lot of these discussions, a lot of people have very like passionate views on and very strong beliefs, but when we kind of strip it down, there's all of this missing context that once you apply it to a real world setting, a lot of the debates sort of smooth out, and it's like, yeah, I guess that could be. And that's how I like that about Steve too, because that's how a lot of his podcasts end up, where it's, he's and I can tell, you as well, it's like once we appreciate the context that's required, it's like a lot of it comes down to preference.
Absolutely.
And just the practical benefits of both sides of the coin.
Right. And as you said, man, it is funny to even see like how even like conversations like this, how like minute of a difference one is like more optimal than the other, like actually how minute of a difference that probably actually would be for like the amount of gains I'm making when it's like, okay, but I also only slept 5 hours last night and my stress is, it's for sure a very nuanced conversation.
And like when I think of the people, I mean, you can go into any gym and see people training like idiots, and they're like in the acute sense, they might be getting a good training stimulus. But I think ultimately what gets people the most gains over time is staying healthy. I think that I ultimately think that's what it comes down to for most people. And keeping them in the gym and not burning out, because especially as a natural athlete, it's like you have to like the process, otherwise it's going to be like if you're looking in the mirror and expecting visual changes every 2 weeks or week, it's not going to happen. Maybe in a fat loss phase, but like in when it comes to muscle growth, unless you're like a complete beginner, it's like you have to embrace some of the challenge of how slow this process is. And I think that's why these discussions are fun to have, is because it's like, okay, I know that this is going to be slow no matter what. Let's just make it less slow. let's try to mitigate how painfully slow this process is.
On that depressing note, I don't want to take too much more of your time, man. This has been a super fun conversation, and I appreciate it. Before I let you go, will you just tell everyone where they can find you and anything at all you'd like to plug?
Yeah, so I'm probably best just reached on Instagram at BD Minor. That's probably where I'm at most in terms of content. Like if I'm on like podcasts, I'll usually post them there. And then I'm one of the head lecturers at JPS Fitness, their coaching mentorship program. They've got a great group of presenters and lecturers there, and is a great, very, very, very good program to if you're an aspiring coach and want to learn everything from the business side of being an online coach or a personal trainer up to programming RIR. It's very all encompassing. So I would recommend, I mean, you can learn about that. I think I have a link in my profile on Instagram. And then I haven't posted about it yet, but I'm going to be doing Kabuki Strength is doing this educational week, this remote week-long educational series with, I think they have like 40 presenters that are doing it, and I'm going to be presenting on power building and some of the, like, a conceptual discussion on how we can kind of integrate all of this together, and
Okay.
why I think it's not as big of a problem as most people may make it out to be.
Right.
So, but I'll post about that on my page once I have more information and a link to
I am
provide
excited to
it.
hear
So,
more about that myself.
yeah, appreciate it. So,
Awesome. Well, I will link all up in the show notes. And again,
all right,
thank you for being here, man. I
all
appreciate it.
right, appreciate it, Jeremiah.